You are listening to The Memory Keeper by Evan Vaile. Chapter 2.
Deep within the underground facility, an old man was waiting in the quiet of observation room number 12. Between the fingers of one hand, he held a dwindling cigarette, its thin trail of smoke drifting toward the ceiling. He had once been a tall man, but old age and the weight of deep regrets were working to shorten his stature. A lifetime of cigarette smoking had sucked any suggestion of youth from his face, but his suit was immaculately pressed and his gaze was sharp and calculating. He stood alone, with a dozen empty seats behind him and a wall of bulletproof glass in front. The badge displayed on the breast pocket of his suit read Visitor 042, a clearance that afforded him access to the unsecured areas of the prison. The observation room was one such area. It overlooked an operating theatre, at that moment unattended. The visitor raised the cigarette to his lips and drew deeply, contemplating what he had seen in the previous hour during his tour of the program. His translucent reflection stared back at him and mirrored his motions. There was a darkness to his expression. Like the entire complex, the operating theatre down below contained an assortment of technology that he had never seen in his many years working as a government physician. He never envisioned that the program would grow so large. And now, years after he had created this monster, he found himself powerless to stop its progress. The sudden entrance of 3 masked doctors into the operating theatre broke his reverie. They guided 2 teenage prisoners on stretchers, each of whom was wearing green prison-issue clothing. The visitor leaned closer to the glass and examined the faces of the doctors and then the faces of the prisoners. Only the eyes of the doctors were visible beneath their surgical masks, and he didn't recognize any of them. In any event, the doctors were unaware of his presence in the observation room because the glass was only transparent on his side. Through a speaker in the ceiling, he heard the muffled sounds of one of the prisoners being removed from a stretcher and placed on the operating table in the center of the theatre. The doctors concentrated their attention on that teenager. A bulky piece of equipment that consisted of a robotic arm with a device attached to its end presided over the head of the table. While 2 of the doctors worked to secure the boy's head inside a metal restraint, the third keyed instructions into a computer console. The visitor had forgotten about his cigarette. He watched the events with a terrible fascination. Moments later, the robotic arm executed several preparatory motions in the air above the helpless boy's head, as though it were warming up, the way a butcher sharpens his blade in anticipation of the first cut. The 2 doctors charged with the task of positioning the teenager used a small steel claw to prise his left eye open, revealing the large white eyeball in its blood-red socket. His head appeared to be entirely restrained, his left eyeball bared before the hovering robotic arm. From behind the visitor came the sound of a door whispering open. He turned around as 4 middle-aged men stepped into the observation room, led by a 5th who was wearing a security badge that read Director. The director was a short man, with eyes so dark his pupils seemed completely dissolved within their depths. His gaze fixed on the visitor's face as soon as he entered the observation room. His carefully styled hair seemed as artificial as his smile, and the overall effect struck the visitor as being a face well suited to hiding 100 nasty secrets. Most noticeable of all was his enormous nose, which wriggled and twitched as he spoke. The other 4 men the visitor knew nothing about, though each was wearing a badge the equivalent of his own temporary pass to the facility. They were all well dressed and moved with an air of importance. The director extended his hand in welcome. "Doctor," he began, as the pair shook hands. "I'm sorry I wasn't available this morning when you arrived. I had hoped to take you through that part of the tour myself." "No matter," the visitor replied. "Your staff was very helpful." The director nodded and said, "I'm glad to hear that. May I introduce you to my colleagues?" The visitor shook hands with each as the director made the introductions. An American, an Englishman, a Canadian, and a Frenchman, each representing their respective governments. As names were being exchanged, the director's gaze darted over the visitor's shoulder, and he looked at the procedure being conducted in the operating theatre below. Gentlemen," he said, turning to the other men, "may I direct your attention to the operating theatre? I see we have arrived just in time to watch a subject receive an iris marker." He moved to the wall and spoke into the intercom. "Doctor, could you feed the video image through to the observation room, please?" The masked doctor standing at the computer console glanced up and nodded in acquiescence. Moments later, a television monitor mounted in the wall of the observation room flickered to life. An image of the prisoner's eyeball filled the screen, unblinking and beginning to turn an angry red color. "The device they are using is a specially designed laser," the director explained, "which allows us to permanently mark the eye without affecting the subject's vision. We've found the technique entirely satisfactory for encoding each subject upon arrival at the facility." Suddenly, with inhuman speed and precision, the robotic arm closed the distance between its metal tip and the subject. On the monitor, the pupil of the boy's eye looked like a solar eclipse surrounded by an aurora of vivid blue. Then, with tiny movements, the laser began to imprint a code, letter by letter, in a semicircle around the black pupil. The doctors in the operating theatre stood silently and watched the automated machine do its work. It took only a few moments for the laser to mark the boy for life, and then the robotic arm retracted away from the subject's face and remained stationary. The visitor looked back at the monitor. There, printed in precise black letters around the boy's pupil, was the code PXS-202. Program Experiment. Subject number 202. The director turned back to his guests. "Each subject has received an iris marker just like you've seen. This subject won't even be aware that we have altered the coloring of his eye unless he peers very closely in the mirror, or one of the other subjects tells him, which will invariably happen. At the outset, we used to simply tattoo the code into a subject's wrist in the conventional manner, but we quickly had problems with that technique. Many of the subjects would self-mutilate and cut the codes off their skin. There was nowhere on the human body we could tattoo them that they wouldn't cut. So our scientists came up with the idea of the iris marker, in the hope that the subjects wouldn't cut their eyes in order to remove the codes. Turns out we were right," he chuckled. "We haven't had any problems with the subjects removing their codes since then." The visitor couldn't seem to manage to smile with the others. "What is the boy's name?" he asked. In the operating theatre, the doctors were removing the subject from the table and preparing the machine for the second patient. The director spoke into the intercom, then listened for the reply. "Nylander," the director said when he turned back to the visitor. "Interesting case. I remember reading his file. Graphic hallucinations of murder. Shall we move on?" The visitor stubbed out his cigarette and merely nodded. As there were no further questions, the director led the group from the observation room and through a series of dimly lit corridors that wound ever deeper into the facility. The international guests listened to the director as he spoke, while the visitor was quiet and thoughtful. The corridors were unsecured areas where the program's subjects would never be permitted to venture, and the staff members who moved about the hallways were unmasked and wearing the typical business attire of the white-collar masses above. The visitor heard a distant rumble pass overhead, like the slow peal of thunder from a coming storm, and he realized that it was a passenger train speeding through the subway tunnels. The program was deep beneath the city, but only meters below the city's underground train system. The director continued his presentation as he walked. Immediately after the subjects receive their iris markers, they are taken to quarantine for 20 days of isolation from the rest of the group. Each and every subject is a rare specimen, literally hand-picked from thousands. Naturally, in a facility of this nature, we're very vigilant against infectious disease. We've gone to a lot of trouble to make these subjects disappear from the world above, so we don't want them dying from merely natural causes. There were nods of approval from the international guests. And as for losses from unnatural causes, the director added, we estimate those will be in the order of 45 to 50%. This comment produced a murmur of discussion from among the internationals. High losses, no? The Frenchman suggested finally. The director stopped and directed his full attention to the group. High, but necessary. In order for a study of this kind to be successful, we need to be working with very pure blood. And the only way we can be certain of that is to let the weaker subjects be killed off, leaving the strong to survive. Remember, gentlemen, we're not creating killers here. We're simply allowing these natural-born killers to realize their true tendencies. All of the techniques we employ are for the purpose of encouraging the subjects to express their inner psychopathic desires. They're already killers. We just encourage them to be their true selves. The visitor said nothing. The American rubbed his chin pensively, then asked, "So how long do you estimate it will take?" 1 year, the director replied evenly. 1 year to isolate a group of alpha serial killers, and then an additional year to isolate the genetic sequence responsible for their behavior. 2 years in total, gentlemen, to find the gene of the serial killer. He paused to gauge their reactions. Your respective governments have good reason to be interested. The internationals nodded their heads somberly. But there will be time this afternoon to discuss the details. It's almost 12:30, and feeding time. I think you'll want to see this. He swiped his card through the security lock, and the door clicked open. The observation room was the same as the previous one, with 2 rows of empty seats at the back and a large wall of glass at the front. Another television monitor was mounted against the wall to one side. The group's footsteps were silent on the thick carpet, and then the director closed the door and joined his guests at the window. This observation room overlooked a large auditorium entirely devoid of furniture, which was slowly filling with teenagers. 2 doors on opposite walls were open, and it was through these that the teenagers entered. Some of the teens appeared alert and fearful, watching what the others on the far side were doing, casting suspicious glances from face to face. Others were sniggering uncontrollably as though the silence of the room was too much to bear. The visitor's normally steady hands shook as he lit another cigarette. They were a motley bunch, some with scars across their faces. They were all clothed alike, loose blue trousers and t-shirts. All of them were barefoot, with shaved heads and sickly pale skin. As the numbers of teenagers escalated, so did the tension in the auditorium. They soon formed into packs of 6 or 7, each posse slinking about the room like a large predator in search of a victim. Some of them postured aggressively at others and staked out their territory. Each of the 4 walls of the auditorium contained numerous slots, and it quickly became apparent that the floor space directly in front of these slots was valuable property. Packs jostled for position, but no blood was spilt. When the last of the teenagers had entered the room, the 2 doors were closed, and the microphone in the observation room conveyed the metallic clunk as a locking mechanism sealed the doors shut. The director leaned against the bulletproof glass. "This is the only time each day that the subjects are together in the one enclosure," he said. "Notice how the social hierarchies have quickly developed. Even more interesting is the fact that the subjects adopt aliases soon after they arrive. The kids actually invent the names themselves. We're not sure why. Each subject is designated a code for iris marking, but the physicians now find it easier to identify them by the names they take on. For example, the director continued, indicating several subjects on the far side. The pack over there consists of Shady Atkins, Frankie Fix, Loco, Roan, Styles, and Magnolia." "A female?" the American asked with raised eyebrows. The director nodded. "We have 7 girls in the study. 1 has already been killed off." The director turned his attention to the layout of the auditorium. "The food is issued through the slots in the walls. As you can see, the subjects are quite used to the routine. There are 50 subjects down there right now, but they will only be provided with enough food for half that number. We only feed them once a day, so some of them are going to miss out. Under these conditions, the situation quickly turns volatile." The visitor watched the prisoners milling around like cattle in a yard. "Why do you have to do it this way?" he asked. "Aren't the isolation cells enough?" The director locked eyes with the visitor. "The isolation cells only desensitize the subjects to violence," he replied flatly. "My mother, God bless her heart, could be desensitized in an isolation cell. Bombarding an individual with violent images, in combination with food and sleep deprivation, will have that effect on anybody. In order to separate the killers from the calves, we need to allow the subjects to act out their aggressions. We need to let them become the killers they are." The director made a dramatic gesture. "Hence, the feeding room." At that moment, the feeding slots opened and small plastic cartons began to tumble out. The grim silence of the feeding room was suddenly replaced with the desperate and anguished cries of 50 hungry human beings. The teenagers, fortunate enough to seize a parcel, clutched it to their chests and scrambled away from the mass of writhing bodies. "Today we're feeding them a meat broth," the director explained as he reduced the volume of the observation room's microphone to a comfortable howl. "It has all their vitamin and mineral requirements." Scuffles began to erupt on the fringes of the crowd. Those who had managed to secure a parcel had to fight to keep it. In the confusion, others managed to escape to a quiet corner where they tore open the cartons and hungrily shoveled the broth into their mouths. "We provide them with knives and forks in the parcels," the director said, "but they never use them, at least not to eat with. The metal detectors at the exits prevent them from leaving the feeding room with the steel implements." Soon, the shrieking began to quiet, and most of the subjects had retreated to eat. Some of them looked scratched and bloodied for their ordeal, but seemed insensible to their injuries as they devoured the food. The crowd at the feeding slots dissipated, and the skirmishes for the remaining food began. The visitor watched one emaciated subject wail pitifully and spin to face the nearest inmate with food still in his hands. The target glanced up too late to scurry away to safety. They locked limbs and tumbled over, little thumbs gouging at one another's eyes, faces screwed up and entirely devoid of innocence. The metal knife clattered from the carton to the floor, and moments later found its way into the hands of the gaunt prisoner. With a subhuman howl of fury, he drove it through the neck of his rival and then scampered away with the remains of the food. The hacking gasps for breath from the dying boy drew barely a glance from those around him, still busy eating their meal for the day. Their only acknowledgement of the death of one of their own was to shift aside as the blood slowly spread across the floor like a lengthening shadow. The director clapped his hands together enthusiastically and turned to his guests. There was a gleam in his eyes that he made no effort to hide. "That one's a pureblood. Calls himself Slayer," he said, as much to himself as to the others. "So, who feels ready for some lunch?" Somehow the visitor wasn't surprised to find that the facility contained a lavish banquet hall, furnished with luxury appointments including crystal chandeliers, which tinkled quietly whenever the trains passed overhead. The very idea of eating after witnessing such a horrible display made the visitor's stomach turn, but the other men apparently felt no such qualms and attacked the meal with gusto. The 6 were arranged around the expansive table with the director at its head. No service staff presented themselves, and the men discussed the scientific aspects of everything they had seen that morning. Soon, when the chicken bones had been picked clean, the talk turned to the matters at hand. The American accepted the director's offer of a cigar. "This is a very impressive facility, Doctor," he said from within his cloud of smoke. "Very impressive, but you are yet to tell us how you intend to keep all of this a secret for such a long period of time, and how you can be so certain that none of the subjects will ever escape. My government is considering assisting you by providing a number of subjects, but it has no interest in becoming entangled in a very public exposition of a human rights violation, even if it is within someone else's country." There were grunts of acknowledgement from the other internationals. The director leaned back in his leather chair, a self-satisfied grin on his face. He spread his hands widely on the tabletop as if to hold it down. "General, we have armed guards at every door, cameras in every hall, and retinal scanners every 20 feet. Nobody in this facility can walk from here to there without a dozen security personnel being aware of it. This dining room is one of the few rooms without cameras and scanners. And I hasten to add, there is only one passage to the surface, which is watched around the clock. So if you'll excuse my language, General, we've got security coming out of our asses." "I take your point, Doctor," the American replied dryly. "But the fact remains that people make mistakes. Any system will fail given enough time. And that's one thing prisoners have an abundance of. A long time ago, they said Alcatraz was unbeatable. Alcatraz was beaten by adult prisoners who essentially dug through the walls and swam to their freedom," the director said. "They had access to materials and know-how. The subjects of this facility are teenagers with mental health issues, some of whom struggle to even read or write, let alone form plans sophisticated enough to breach the secured areas. They are given access to nothing which could assist them in their efforts. And even if they did make it to the outer walls, they would have to dig through 10 feet of reinforced concrete using nothing sharper than their fingernails. The visitor touched the flickering flame of his silver lighter to the cigarette between his lips, and then snapped the lighter shut. "What about the Deacon?" he asked, leveling his gaze at the director. "Isn't he being kept here too?" The director's expression was inscrutable. "Yes, he is," he answered carefully. The American exhaled smoke across the table at the visitor. "Who is the Deacon?" The visitor flicked his gaze in the direction of the director and noticed the frown crowning his forehead. The director pushed his empty plate aside and leaned forward. "The Deacon is, in many ways, the very first subject of the program. He is a man in his mid-30s who was convicted 10 years ago of a particularly brutal series of murders. We call him the Deacon because he was an ordained minister of the church at the time of his crimes. In fact, he used the regular church gatherings as opportunities to select his victims. He's a serial killer from top to toe, one that would have fitted in quite well in the program at a young age. The good doctor here," the director said, indicating the visitor with a nod of his head, "is the man the government asked to prepare a study of the Deacon and his crimes." The doctor's research was groundbreaking, but ultimately limited by the technological constraints of the time. Genetic research was in its infancy 10 years ago. "All of my own work here at the program is based on the original study of the Deacon." The director let his gaze drift from one man to the next. "But the Deacon won't be a problem. He's being kept separated from the other subjects on the far side of the facility. He's living out his days here because we removed him from the world above some years ago. Officially, he's deceased. And let me assure you all, at no time does he have any contact with the other subjects." The visitor sat silently and ruminated over his time spent with the Deacon. His research had been pioneering, but it never transgressed the boundaries of decency and morality. The Deacon was a murderer, but still a human being. What was being done in the program was far beyond what the visitor had ever contemplated, and totally out of his control. He was a passive observer now, kept in the loop because of his work many years ago. The American was talking around his cigar as he smoked. "What about redundancy? What's your backup plan if, for whatever reasons, there is a breakdown in security?" "There is a backup plan, General, my own personal addition," the director said. "If you care to look up, you'll notice some vents set into the ceiling." The group peered skywards. The visitor saw a number of unobtrusive circular vents, each roughly the size of his hand. "Vents such as these are in every room throughout the entire facility," the director continued. "Ordinarily, tear gas is delivered through vents like these in the feeding rooms to control the subjects. But in the event of the inmate population gaining control of this facility, we have something more lethal available to us. A gas which would be fatally effective, you could say. I call it Protocol Z." The American shifted around uncomfortably in his leather chair. He was sitting directly beneath one of the vents in the ceiling. "Does your staff know of this procedure?" he asked. "No," the director replied flatly. "But they are well paid, and this procedure is a satisfactory risk to their lives." "What about yourself?" the Canadian asked. "Do you think I would design a security system that would kill me?" the director answered. "I will be able to get out in time, should it ever be activated." The American kept one wary eye on the vent in the ceiling and addressed the visitor. "What do you think, Doctor?" The visitor tapped his cigarette over the ashtray and sighed smoke. "I think that locking 200 highly insane and possibly highly intelligent individuals in a single facility is a serious error of judgment. The fact that the subjects are minors makes little difference. If anything, it makes the situation more dangerous. Teenagers are adaptable and unpredictable. As they grow up, they'll learn ways to beat the system. When I conducted my study on the Deacon years ago, I never imagined that my work would lead to this." The director's dark gaze turned menacing. "Doctor, I can't understand that position. I really can't." He scowled. "You of all people should be impressed by what I've built here. In just a few years we can crack the genetic sequence that creates a serial killer. Just imagine what an achievement that will be for science, not to mention for society." The director slouched back in his chair with an expression of disgust. This facility is unbreachable, he snorted. The subjects can't escape. The visitor nodded. It was out of his control now. But God help us if they do, he replied.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.